I told myself I would be surgical. I told myself I'd leave no fingerprints where it mattered. Both were lies I leaned on like scaffolding. After the week of watching them, I stopped sleeping in a normal way. Nights became sprints of checking records, cross-referencing receipts, tracing travel windows. I did what my work had taught me to do. I collected anomalies and let them form a picture. The picture told me two things I couldn't afford to ignore. One, Lena wasn't sloppy. She'd covered her tracks well enough that only someone trained to look would find the seams. Two, Marcus Hale's operations had holes, small gaps where money could pass through without being noticed, and a human courier made those gaps useful. I could have walked away. I told myself that the ethical path was to leave, to cut contact, to close the chapter and salvage whatever dignity a man like me could keep. But there's a particular clarity that comes when betrayal is both personal and professional. The urge to correct the ledger, to rebalance an account that had been debited without consent. That sentiment is rarely noble. It's practical, cold, and very addictive. I began with shadows, not technical tricks. I don't need to explain how to forge timestamps or mask IPs. Those are dirty tools and useless for absolution. Instead, I manufactured doubt in human rooms where doubt grows fastest. Office corridors, social circles, and the small, polite arenas where reputations live. I didn't send accusations into the open. I delivered questions. A vendor received a gentle, anonymous nudge about a misdirected payment. A partner at Marcus's firm was quietly asked if he'd seen certain receipts. An old colleague of mine, trustworthy, discreet, received a casual note about unusual patterns on one of the clients he'd audited. People who live in tidy worlds hate disorder. They call for audits, statements, clarifications. When enough polite people ask polite questions, teams begin to check clocks and sign-offs and phone logs. It's slow. It's boring. It is effective. Lena noticed first in small ways. An HR ping about clarification here. A required training module there, harmless on the surface, but corrosive when stacked. She started checking her phone in the middle of dinner, tapping at messages with hands that looked suddenly foreign to me. She asked if I'd gotten any unusual emails for clients I'd worked with. I lied and said no. Lying had become a tool, a rusted but handy instrument. Marcus tightened his smile in public and began to cancel after-work drinks. He looked smaller in photos that week. The confidence of a man used to bending circumstances had the tremor of someone being measured instead of measuring. I felt a brief, childish satisfaction at that. Seeing them worry, watching the scaffolding go from sound to suspect, felt like proof that the world still noticed when balance shifted. But nothing I did was theatrical. I learned long ago that loud acts attract the wrong kind of attention. So I favored patience. A rumor seated in the right inbox. A duplicate invoice left on a copier, the quiet forwarding of a questionable receipt to a compliance address. These were whispers that become instinct. People started to check one another. Marcus's assistants found extra approvals they thought were routine. Their eyes widened. They made notes. They took meetings. The machine of corporate caution started grinding. There was also the personal front. I began to withdraw, to be pleasant but distracted. Anger shows like a handprint on a clean shirt. I wanted them to mistake my distance for stress, not suspicion. Lena called once in tears. She said someone had accused her team of irregularities, and that HR wanted her to stay late and answer questions. Her voice broke on that call in a way I'd not heard before. In the small hours, I listened to her inhale and exhale over the line and felt the old part of me, the part who still loved her, fight with the new part that wanted to see consequences. The two halves didn't reconcile. When the first internal inquiry arrived at Marcus's firm, it was the procedural form of a paper trail being unspooled. Polite emails requesting documents. A vendor flagged for review. They called it due diligence. The call sounded wrong in my ears. I'd set the wheels, and now they were turning on their own. Seeing the auditors arrive gave me an odd sensation, a mixture of relief and nausea. Relief because the truth I'd found would be tested. Nausea because truth, when exposed, doesn't land only on guilty shoulders. They fought back in small ways. Marcus had resources, lawyers who move in careful circles, PR people who can reposition a story. Lena's superiors whispered about process inadequacies and the damage of false narratives. She was called into meetings that afternoon and asked, politely, to account for any recent vendor interactions. Each polite question was a line tightening, a rope pulled in slow motion. Then the threats started. Not threats to me at first, but to people close to Lena, a vendor who received a call from someone asking if they'd ever seen money routed under Marcus's name. A junior analyst at our firm who'd once helped me run a small reconciliation was suddenly reassigned because his logs were inconsistently maintained. Collateral is the cruel arithmetic of leverage. It arrives quietly, and it hurts the least powerful first. I watched helpless and strangely satisfied as the ripple grew, and I hated myself for both feelings. Everything shifted the day Lena confronted me. She had come home early, eyes red, a folder clutched like a talisman. She didn't accuse me. She asked, as if hoping for a miracle. "Did you tell them anything?" She whispered. For a second I considered being the man who admits his sins and asks for forgiveness. For a second I thought of walking away and letting her navigate the ruins she'd built. I didn't choose either. No, I lied. Not yet. The truth was a brand I wasn't ready to bear in public. "I wanted to give you a chance to fix this." She looked at me, then really looked, and there was no softness left in her gaze. "Fix it," she said. "You don't get to fix what you broke." I had broken things, yes, but not in the way she intended. I'd broken trust, and also the anonymity she'd relied on. "I'm not trying to ruin you," I said. "I'm trying to stop you." Those words landed like shards. She left the room and packed a bag. For the first time I felt panic not as a weapon but as a potential consequence. She stormed out into a raw sky, and I watched the door close like the slanting of a final accounting ledger. The next days escalated. An auditor requested access to a subcontractor's invoices. Compliance asked for backup documentation for a week's worth of approvals. Marcus's office, usually impenetrable, had to answer for transactions they'd knotted through. People with power started to use it to protect themselves. Those without it found themselves exposed. It was messy and precise at the same time. Then the first message appeared. No signature, no flourish. "Stop," it said, simple as a post-it. Whoever sent it knew enough to know I'd read it, and enough to know I'd keep going. The threat sharpened the edges of the months ahead. I had started this work thinking the only risk was legal exposure for the guilty. I'd forgotten that people who lose control get mean. They have a way of making fear travel beyond the person who started it, and suddenly the ledger you meant to balance began demanding payments in the lives of others. I watched my careful strategy spawn consequences that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with leverage. And yet, in the quiet between moves, a darker thought settled. Maybe that was the point. Maybe actors who bend systems count on the collateral to keep others from digging. Maybe the cruelty was the real currency. I leaned back in my chair and tried to imagine the next precise cut. But the plan I once held in tidy columns had become a messy accounting of human ruin. That is the hazard of architecture built on people. It collapses unpredictably, and the falling pieces are alive. My name's Daniel Ward, 38 years old, a financial consultant out of Boston. On paper, I live a clean, calculated life: white shirts, polished shoes, a tidy apartment with too many books I never read past the second chapter. Discipline was my religion. Predictability, my prayer. Then Lena happened. I met her at a client mixer 2 years ago, the kind of event where everyone pretends to enjoy warm Prosecco and surface-level conversation. She wasn't like the others. Her laugh had edges, her eyes carried something restless, and when she shook my hand, I felt something shift in the quiet architecture of my life. She worked in marketing, smart and confident, the kind of woman who never had to demand attention because the room naturally bent toward her. We moved fast. Too fast, maybe. Within months, she was staying over more nights than not. Her clothes crept into my closet, her toothbrush beside mine. She'd text me in the mornings, "Coffee's on. Come home early tonight." It felt real. It felt safe. I'd been through hollow relationships before, ones that ended quietly, like a light fading out. But with Lena, everything burned bright. She challenged me, laughed at my seriousness, and made the world feel wide again. For the first time in years, I thought maybe I'd finally outsmarted loneliness. Until the pattern changed. It started small, an extra shift, a late meeting, her phone turned face down during dinner. I noticed because I notice everything. It's what made me good at my job, tracking discrepancies, reading numbers that didn't add up. But you never want to believe your own life is part of an equation gone wrong. One night, I woke up to the sound of her shower running. Till 14 a.m. her phone buzzed on the nightstand, once, twice, then silence. I told myself not to look. I told myself that trust means not needing proof. But when the same message preview flashed again, tomorrow 8 p.m. same place, curiosity broke the leash. No name. Just a number. When she came back into the room, hair damp, wearing my shirt, I asked softly, "Working late again tomorrow?" She smiled, that rehearsed little smile that I used to think was innocence. "Yeah, you know how it is." But I didn't know. Not yet. The next day, I left the office early. I didn't tell her. I parked outside her building and waited. The city was gray, rain drawing streaks across the windshield. When she came out, she wasn't dressed for work. Jeans, leather jacket, her hair down. I watched her get into a black Audi that stopped right in front of the building. The driver got out to open her door. He was in his 40s, broad shoulders, dark coat. Not someone she'd just met. She leaned in to kiss him before the car pulled away. Not a friendly kiss. Not hesitation. It was familiarity. I sat there long after they were gone, the world around me blurring. I didn't feel heartbreak. Not yet. I felt data, inputs, patterns, a clean structure of deceit. That night, I didn't confront her. I cooked dinner, poured wine, pretended everything was fine. I needed to understand more before I acted. Over the next week, I followed patterns. Calls made, locations shared, a rhythm. She wasn't careless. She thought she was invisible. But digital traces don't lie. The man's name was Marcus Hale, CEO of a mid-sized investment firm. Married, father of 2. I found photos of them together, hidden in metadata tagged under fake accounts she thought were private. It wasn't just infidelity. It was something else. Business trips that matched Marcus's travel, shared transactions in small amounts between her card and offshore accounts linked to his firm. Someone was laundering something, and my girlfriend was the courier. That realization was the moment I stopped being the betrayed man. I became the analyst again. She wasn't just cheating on me. She was using me, my firm, my connections, my trust. And in that moment, something inside me switched. I wasn't going to yell. I wasn't going to beg. I was going to dismantle her life, piece by piece, with the same precision she thought made her untouchable. It wouldn't be revenge. It would be accounting. The auditors started asking for backup files like a priest asking for confessions, quietly, insistently, with an air of moral inevitability. They wanted full trails, timestamps, approvers, IP logs. Every polite request felt like a scalpel. Marcus's office tightened like a fist. His assistant's smile thinned. Lena began to answer rehearsed questions with a voice that sounded borrowed from someone who'd practiced being believable. For a week, the apartment became a war room. I spread ledgers and printouts across the kitchen table, mapping the routes money had taken, the weak links they'd trusted. Patterns stared up at me, small repeated transfers, the same shell vendor names reused with tiny variations, invoice numbers that bumped by unusual increments. It was elegant in a cold way, the sort of engineering that delights when you understand it and sickens when you watch where it leads. The auditors found an old subcontractor invoice I hadn't expected them to pull. It matched one of the fake entries I'd planted, but in the wrong column. A careless placement by someone under pressure, a human error in an otherwise tidy fraud. For a moment I thought my plan had been exposed by my own arrogance. I imagined hearings, headlines, confessions from men with expensive ties. Instead, the company froze. They didn't call the press. They put hold notices on payouts. They pulled accounts down like blankets. The panic that followed felt almost religious. Men who believed themselves immune suddenly counting the cost of being seen. I watched Lena in those days and learned how thin the actress can be when the play demands more than she was trained to give. Her fingers tapped at her phone like she was trying to steady a tremor. Sometimes she looked at me with a plea that asked for comfort without naming the word. Other times she looked at me with something colder, a kind of appraisal that measured what I'd done and what I'd become. "What do you want from me?" she asked one night, voice tight, after a particularly brutal meeting where a compliance officer asked her to explain a series of approvals she insisted she hadn't seen. The truth is a weight I'd learned to balance. The admission would have been lighter if I'd meant it to be. "I wanted consequences," I said. "Proportionate ones." She laughed then, a short, disbelieving sound. "Proportionate? You made this personal, Daniel. You dragged people in who weren't ready. You chose collateral like it was currency." I'd rehearsed answers that would make me look noble. I would say I only wanted to stop the bleeding, to prevent others from being used. Those words would have sounded better on paper than they felt in my mouth. The act of choosing who pays for your anger is a kind of tyranny. You're awarding suffering with your handshake and calling it justice. They started to fight back. Small things at first, an anonymous complaint about my firm's billing practices, a vendor calling to say they'd had a security review of our accounts. Someone leaked a rumor about my history, a past client dispute that had been settled quietly. The tactics were surgical, designed not to break me immediately, but to make me flinch in public. Reputations are delicate instruments. A single well-timed whisper can sour client trust faster than exposure. Then the escalation became louder. An envelope with no return address sat on my mat one morning. Inside, a Polaroid of my father's mailbox on a December afternoon, a crude circle of red pen around the house number. On the back, 2 words, "Stop digging." There was an economy to the message, efficient, callous. For a moment I felt the old animal fear, hands near mine that could squeeze the life out of more than my pride. I called him. My father's voice sounded ordinary, distracted. "Some man came by asking about tax records," he said. "He left a card. Said he was from an audit company." The panic on the line was a brittle thing. It hit me harder than any corporate threat. Men who make choices often forget the reach of those choices. The ledger expands beyond its margins. I considered going to the police, to Detective Rivera-style procedure. But the truth is the system is slow and the men who break it are patient. I also knew that admitting I'd planted documents would turn that slow machine into something that chews my credibility. Self-preservation is a practical skill. It's a thing you use when you are under pressure and the margins are thin. Lena tried to fight back in a way that surprised me. She started compiling her own folder emails, innocuous calendar invites, screenshots of vendor portals. She sat in the apartment for hours, the light from the laptop carving hollows into her cheekbones, building a case of her own. I watched her work with something like admiration and jealousy at once. She was resourceful when she needed to be. She had been all along. The problem was that she'd once chosen the wrong partners, and now she was staring at the consequences. "Why didn't you tell me?" she said one late night, the laptop screen blue in the dark. "If you knew, why not speak up?" "I wanted to see if they'd stop without panic," I said. "I wanted them to be accountable." Her face tightened. "Accountability doesn't mean you get to be the god of consequences." It's a sharp thing to be called a god and told you have the wrong hands. I hardened then. It was a reflex I'd learned in boardrooms, when men tried to look at me with pity and change nothing. The harder I got, the more precise my moves became. I moved files, nudged an old contact to ask a question in a forum Marcus frequented, sent a vendor an offhand query that made compliance start a double check. Each move was chess, and each response taught me more about how to shape the board. But chess is a limited metaphor. Real people bleed and beg. The junior analyst who'd once helped me with a reconciliation got called in and asked the kind of humiliating, detailed questions that feel like slow punishment. He'd been an easy pawn, and he'd lost a week of sleep and reputation. I'd told myself he was collateral. Telling yourself that requires a certain distance from the consequences. One evening, after a day when the company announced it would cooperate fully with an external audit, the kind of phrase that smells like lawyers arranging for damage control, I found Lena in the kitchen with a glass of wine and a face that looked older than the calendar. "Do you regret it?" she asked simply. I could have said yes. I could have said no. I chose a truth that felt weakest. I don't know. She put her hand on the table between us, fingers splayed like an offering or a barrier. "If you ever loved me," she said, "then you should have let me choose how to fall." Those words lodged and sat, heavy as iron. I'd believed I was protecting myself and punishing those who'd used me. Instead, I'd become someone who decided how much pain was allowable, who graded suffering. The ledger in my head had turned into a moral tax collector's list, and I was the only one able to see the arithmetic. The pressure tightened until something snapped. A client of Marcus's, one with influence and a taste for clean reputations, quietly threatened to pull a major contract unless the firm showed immediate remediation. Men with lines to pull pulled them. Marcus, who'd seemed untouchable, started calling in favors. Men I hadn't seen in years reached out to old acquaintances, asking questions about our work, about me. Power does not forgive. It shelters itself by drowning voices. Then a name came up I hadn't expected. Hale and Partners. A shell that appeared in a set of records a junior auditor had found, a ghostly conduit for funds. It had Marcus's fingerprints on paper, but the true ownership traced through a web that hinted at people above him, people who thought themselves insulated. For the first time, my work had a scale I hadn't planned for. This wasn't just a corner off a scan. It was part of a wider architecture. And that terrified me. Bigger players mean more resources, more patience, and uglier responses. The men who live at the top of ledgers can wait until you tire, until you fracture. They will bide their time, and then squeeze. I sat at my table and watched the rain trace new patterns down the window. The city's lights blurred into a smear of orange and white. In the dark, I felt the first honest fear I hadn't permitted myself to feel. Not for my pride, not even for my reputation, but for the people I'd pulled into this. My sister who'd fielded odd calls. The junior analyst whose job now smelled like suspicion. Lena whose face I'd made public in whispers. The ledger had turned. It was no longer only a device for redressing a hurt. It had become a living thing that demanded payment in ways I couldn't fully control. I realized then that the next move mattered less than the shape of the consequence. I could go louder and risk burning everything and everyone. Or I could step back and hand the truth to someone who could use it under law. Both options had costs I wasn't sure I could pay. I closed my laptop, the blue screen ghosting across the ceiling, and felt utterly exhausted. The calm engineer I'd once been had been replaced by a man who understood that sometimes knowing the right thing and doing the right thing are two separate, painful projects. Messages arrived with the casual cruelty of bureaucracy, requests for supporting documents, polite follow-ups, a note from compliance asking for clarification on recurring vendor payments. Each line on a spreadsheet became a little guillotine. People who'd been peripheral assistants who routed approvals, junior accountants who signed reconciliations were asked to recreate entire days from memory. In that lit room of interviews, and typed statements, is a fragile thing. Under pressure it bends until it breaks. I watched them bend through a screen. I watched Lena in her apartment read the same emails I did and press her palms to her eyes as if she were trying to hold something that wanted to fall out. Once, she looked up while I was on speakerphone with an auditor and caught my eye. For a breath she was a woman deciding whether to forgive or confess. She closed her laptop and said she needed air. When she walked into the rain outside, I wanted to go after her and stop her from stepping into whatever future was waiting. Instead I stayed and tightened the screws I had set in motion. My hands knew the work better than my heart did. The company had called in an external forensic team. Those men and women carry a particular stillness. They are meticulous and indifferent to the human bodies behind the data. Their tools churned through logs and receipts the way a surgeon peels away skin. What they found were threads, small, messy anomalies that, when stitched together, suggested a pattern too deliberate for simple incompetence. The name Redwood Consulting came up more than once, and where Redwood led, it opened to offshore nodes and accounts with names that meant nothing until you looked at them in sequence. The pressure moved outward from the firm into the orbit around it. Marcus's board convened emergency sessions. His assistants began leaving their phones on the table like surrendered weapons. Someone placed an op-ed in a trade publication raising questions about procurement practices in logistics firms. It didn't name Marcus, but the insinuation stung. Public relations teams practiced their neutral-sounding senses. Politicians who sat on contracting committees called for reviews. The world responded in the procedural language of power. And I watched it like an observer who'd instigated the reaction, and now had to live in the echo. Then the threats arrived more plainly. An envelope on my doormat with no return address. Inside, a single photograph of my sister's office building, taken from a second-story window, with a note scrawled across the edge. Stop or everyone will stop trusting you too. My sister called in tears. Someone had called her HR line asking about their brother's unusual activities. The junior analyst I'd leaned on for a file was suddenly reassigned to another state. His wife texted me a photograph of his packed desk and an embarrassed note. They said it was best for now. Guilt is an ugly, movable thing. You can feel its weight shift across other people's shoulders. I began to see how deep the well I'd kicked into really ran. Marcus was not without resources. There were men behind him who preferred their names not to be spoken at cocktail parties, men who traded favors in subtext. Whoever owned the ledger behind the ledger had no interest in letting a small, personal war turn into an industry-level scandal. They had patience and networks that could be mean and precise. Late one night, a man came to my stoop. He didn't knock. He left a card tucked beneath a stone. Legal counsel, private matters. No number, no name. Just a promise that they knew how to touch a life without a public scene. I don't know who values discretion more, the guilty or those trying to keep guilt from metastasizing. Either way, the card read like a line in a play where the next act is chorused silence. There were quieter movements too. My bank called to verify a wire I hadn't authorized, an oddity they noticed because someone had tried to move a modest amount through my accounts. A test maybe, to see if I'd flinch. I flinched. I changed passwords, rotated cards, moved cash into accounts with names that would be harder for a curious hand to touch. Paranoia has practical consequences. It makes you busy in ways that look sensible. Then Detective Rivera showed up again. He had that look that said he'd seen men made of better excuses than mine. He wasn't accusatory. He was factual. We have a few leads, he told me. Not all of them point where we'd like. Some point to internal cover-ups. Some point to external interference. If you have more information, give it to us. There was an implied currency in the request. He wanted truth, and truth is messy when it's been edited by a man with motive. I handed him what I could without burning my only leverage. I gave him logs and bank statements that showed the flow of money, but I withheld the clever, forged threads I'd used to start the whole thing. That decision sat like a stone in my gut. Part of me wanted to be clean and verifiable. Part of me wanted to keep a paper lantern in case the world went dark. When Rivera left that night, he said, "You did something reckless. We'll sort it." His tone was placating, not comforting. While law sorted, other hands reached. An anonymous website published a PDF with redacted sections that implied my involvement in instigating the inquiry. The firm's legal team sent a terse letter to anyone who'd shared documents, asking for a cessation of communications. Press inquiries came to my inbox, polite and hungry. It felt like the world had read the breadcrumbs and decided to circle back for the carcass. The worst blow was the day Lena stopped answering. Calls went to voicemail. Her apartment key stopped working in the lock I'd given her. I left messages at numbers she used and found them going to strange operators. Then a message appeared on my answering service, a woman's voice, grainy. "Tell him to stop or he'll lose more than he wants." It wasn't Lena. I didn't know whose voice it was. The implication was surgical. I found myself making decisions out of fear for other people now, not just revenge. I contacted my sister, coached the junior analyst through statements, got legal counsel for a friend who'd been subpoenaed, and for once I chose to share more than conceal. The ledger I'd wanted to balance had expanded into a ledger I needed to manage. The calculus included other lives. In a small mercy, Marcus resigned publicly under the pressure of the board. His announcement said nothing of guilt. It mentioned personal matters and the best decision for all stakeholders. His resignation calmed the markets for a week, and then the whiplash returned, questions about who benefited from certain contracts, and why a show vendor had been paid at specific intervals. Men who once moved anonymously started naming proxies. Handwriting analysts and forensic accountants dug their teeth into the records. It became clear the ledger was not a simple narrative of cause and effect. It was a knot. Pull one thread and find two more tangled at the back. Each move we made neither healed nor destroyed wholly. It redirected, sometimes toward justice, sometimes toward revenge, sometimes toward bankruptcy of reputation. There were nights I thought about walking away entirely, burn my devices, disappear for a while, let the storm pass. But then I pictured the vendors who'd lose a critical invoice, the junior analyst whose career I'd nudged into turbulence, my sister fielding uncomfortable calls. Running would be taking the easy coward's route. It would be leaving the ledger unpaid in other hands. Instead, I changed tack. I began to cultivate allies inside the system who wanted truth more than they feared scandal. I quietly reached out to an ethics reporter I trusted and gave a narrow set of documents that showed the flow of funds without my fingerprints. I set up secure conversations with one of the board members who had begun to fear the scope of what had been happening on his watch. I provided hard, irrefutable evidence, bank copies, third-party confirmations that could not be contaminated by an accusation of manipulation. That was the clean work the forensics could stand behind. It was slow. It was boring. It was necessary. And still, the ledger demanded more. The quiet men with money found ways to bend procedure. They send emissaries who wear suits like armor and offer settlements for silence. They explain consequences in measured tones. One such emissary bought my sister dinner with offers of a job transfer and careful reassurances about protecting her from anything unpleasant. I saw the exchange through a security feed and felt bile climb my throat. Their reach was surgical, their patience thicker than mine. The apartment felt like a command center and a cell simultaneously. I slept in fits. Lena's absence became another variable I had to manage. Would she reappear and cooperate? Had she fled to safety or joined them deeper into whatever architecture had used her? The questions multiplied, and answers were costly. In the end, the choice narrowed into what it always does in these private wars: keep pushing until you have everything burned to ash, and risk losing the very people you tried to protect. or hand clean evidence to proper authorities, and risk watching some predators slither free on technicalities you helped create. Both roads demanded sacrifice. I made calls, pooled documents, arranged meetings. I braced myself for recriminations and for the slow, grinding hearing of the legal machine. Somewhere between the threats and the small mercies, it became less about making them pay and more about protecting the ones who hadn't chosen this ledger. When I shut off the lights that night and looked at the dark rectangle of the window, I realized I'd already paid a price I hadn't meant to calculate. The currency had been other people's sleep, reputations, and trust. The ledger had turned from an instrument of correction into an accounting of damage. Weeks blurred into one another, full of calls from lawyers, clipped emails, and small, strategic silences. The official investigation had become public by then. Allegations of financial misconduct within Hale and Partners. Sources claim internal collusion. They didn't name me or Lena, not directly, but anyone who'd been inside the machinery long enough could read between the lines. Marcus was gone. He'd stepped down, fled the country, maybe both. His name vanished from corporate websites within a day, erased like he'd never existed. But his fingerprints were still on too many documents, and people like him don't just disappear. They change shape. Lena, though, she resurfaced 3 weeks after I last heard her voice. She showed up at my apartment door. Same leather jacket, same scent, but her eyes were wrong. Not angry, not even frightened, just hollow. She didn't ask to come in. She just stepped past me, sat on the couch, and stared at the blank TV. "It's over," she said. Her voice was a dry whisper, almost clinical. "Over?" I asked. "How?" "They cut a deal. Marcus took the fall. The firm cleans house. They'll settle the vendors quietly, say it was a procedural oversight. No one's going to jail." It shouldn't have surprised me. Corruption rarely ends in confession. It ends in paperwork and polite language. Still, I felt a dull, nauseating rage rise in my chest. "And you? I'm the mistake they regret but don't prosecute," she said. "They need someone who looks naive enough to be sympathetic. I'll lose my license for a while. That's all." Her hands were trembling. I poured her a drink she didn't touch. "Why'd you come here?" I asked finally. She turned her head, eyes glassy, lips trembling, but not from fear. "Because I wanted to see if you're happy." I didn't answer. Happiness felt like a language from a country I no longer lived in. She stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the city lights. "You think you won, Daniel. You didn't, you just joined them." I wanted to argue, to remind her of what she'd done, the lies, the money, the betrayal. But the words fell apart before I could form them. Maybe she was right. Maybe somewhere along the way I'd traded justice for control, principle for precision. She looked at me one last time. "They said Marcus won't talk, but someone else will. Someone higher. You think you burned the whole house down, but you only lit the curtains." Then she left. That night I didn't sleep. I sat at my desk, the blue glow of my monitor painting shadows on the wall, rereading every file, every email, every little note that had led us here. The investigation would continue, but now it was in hands I didn't trust, men in suits who'd turned truth into currency. Still, I wasn't done. There were backup drives, conversations I'd recorded, paper trails they hadn't found, enough evidence to show that Marcus wasn't the top, that there were others behind the scenes, moving the money like chess pieces. If I turned it all in, maybe it would break through the polite layers of legality. Or maybe it would bury me. I started writing the final report anyway, a confession disguised as analysis. I detailed the money flow, the shell accounts, the false vendors. I wrote everything, even my own manipulations. No one could say later that I'd hidden behind morality. Halfway through I paused. My reflection stared back at me from the black glass of the window, unshaven, sleepless, the kind of man who'd mistaken vengeance for purpose. When the dawn came, I sent one copy of the file to Rivera, another to the reporter, the last one I kept in a safe deposit box. just in case. That morning, I walked along the Charles River, cold air biting through my coat, the city waking around me. For the first time in months, I felt something like quiet, not peace. I don't think men like me get that anymore. But quiet. By noon, my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. You've made your point. We'll be in touch. No signature, no threat, just the kind of tone you hear right before something either ends or begins again. I stared at the words until they blurred. Then I deleted the message and turned the phone off. There's an illusion that vengeance gives you closure. It doesn't. It gives you maintenance, a list of open accounts that will never balance completely. The best you can do is stop adding new debts. That night, I wrote the last line of my confession and closed the file. Ledger closed. Whether anyone ever reads it or buries it isn't my concern anymore. But I know one thing with certainty. No one gets away clean. Not her, not Marcus, not me. Just the echo of what we tried to control, and what it cost to count it.